Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Birth of the FBI by Willard Oliver, narrated by Robertson Dean. Prologue. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was originally simply called the Bureau of Investigation when it was founded on July 26, 1908. To most people, however, the FBI is more closely associated with its most famous director, J. Edgar Hoover, whom many believe created the agency and served as its first director. By the time Hoover assumed the directorship, however, the Bureau had already existed under 4 previous presidential administrations, with 4 directors and 1 interim director. This early history of the FBI is often forgotten, largely because Hoover's tenure, which itself ran through 8 presidential administrations in a span of 48 years, overshadowed everything about that agency. It is not too surprising that many people do not know the origins of the FBI, let alone that it was originally called the Bureau of Investigation. Several recent books, both excellent reads, are subtitled in such a way as to perpetuate the myth that the agency started under J. Edgar Hoover. Brian Burroughs' Public Enemies, America's Greatest Crime Wave and the Birth of the FBI, 1933-34, and David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Both books deal with events that took place early in J. Edgar Hoover's career, suggesting that they were what gave rise to the FBI. While the books themselves are clear about the agency's timeline, they still advance the notion that it was Hoover who really created the FBI. The true birth of the FBI traces back to the presidential administration of Theodore Roosevelt, who created the Bureau of Investigation with the help of his Attorney General, Charles Joseph Bonaparte. Although it could be said that the Bureau was created to respond to serious federal land fraud, the reality is that the FBI emerged from a political fight. President Theodore Roosevelt, finding himself in a political row with Congress over the Secret Service, found a political solution to the problem by creating the Bureau of Investigation. So the true origins of the FBI have little to do with crime waves and criminal investigations, but rather are shrouded in the mystery of politics. In order to understand the fight between the President and Congress in the last years of Roosevelt's administration, one must understand its antecedents. When drafting the Constitution, the Founding Fathers had failed to empower any agency to enforce federal laws. At first, the government relied on the U.S. Marshals Service to perform this function, and later the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. During the Civil War, the government faced yet another criminal problem: curtailing economically debilitating counterfeiting. The government responded by creating a second federal law enforcement agency, the United States Secret Service. After 3 presidential assassinations, that agency also took on the responsibility of protecting America's presidents. When Roosevelt came into office because of an assassin's bullet, he brought with him his penchant for fighting corruption and his love of the outdoors. His conservation beliefs, mixed with his belief in law enforcement, led him to use the powers of his administration to tenaciously fight the land thieves that had become problematic in the West as a result of abuses of the Homestead Acts. When Roosevelt borrowed Secret Service operatives, as they were then called, to investigate fraudulent land deals, Congress became involved in the issue, in part because some of their own had been caught committing those very crimes. After Congressman James A. Tawney attached an amendment to an appropriations bill preventing Roosevelt from borrowing Secret Service operatives to investigate land frauds, Roosevelt created the Bureau of Investigation in response. The fight was now on between Roosevelt and Tawney, and at stake was the very survival of Roosevelt's newly created law enforcement agency. This is the true story of the birth of the FBI. 1. Federal Law Enforcement. The federal law enforcement agencies that we are so familiar with today, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Border Patrol, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, are all administrative inventions of the 20th century. Before the 20th century, writes legal historian Lawrence M. Friedman, criminal justice was overwhelmingly the business of the states, not the federal government. This growth in federal power was primarily driven by the 1919 passage of the Volstead Act, and in 1920 by the enactment of the Great Experiment, Prohibition. Though intoxicating beverages were no longer legal in the United States, the public remained thirsty, and a black market for the sale of alcohol thrived, which in turn gave rise to the mafia. In response, the powers of federal law enforcement agencies were expanded. After Prohibition was overturned in 1933, the federal law enforcement mechanism turned its attention to dangerous narcotics, and by the late 20th century, America was fighting the so-called war on drugs. This, naturally, led to an ever-expanding number of federal law enforcement agencies and their personnel. By the 21st century, because of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and a rise in global terrorism, the federal government established the Department of Homeland Security, which is today filled with all manner of new, reformed, and expanded law enforcement agencies. Before this 20th century expansion, however, law enforcement had been under the purview of local governments. As police historian Samuel Walker explains, criminal law enforcement was mainly the responsibility of the county sheriff and the town constables. In more rural areas, it was the sheriff who served as the chief law enforcement officer, while in larger towns and cities, constables typically oversaw the night watch and possibly a day ward, security practices that had been established in the 13 colonies under English rule. The sheriffs were initially appointed by the colonial governor, who was in turn appointed by the King of England. Sheriffs were the primary law enforcers in the counties, but because they were commonly paid through a system of fees by the county courts, it was more profitable for them to perform civil duties, such as the issuance of subpoenas and collecting taxes. The career of a sheriff could be very lucrative indeed. As police historian Roger Lane explains, the basic income, in addition to jailer's fees, was $3 a day for attendance in court, and to this was added a schedule of fees and expenses for over a dozen different kinds of services. But the biggest gains lay in serving personal civil actions. The sheriff collected 4% of damages and costs in judgments of up to $100, 2% between $1 and $200, and 1% of all over $200. This is why the routine business of police simply did not occupy or concern the typical sheriff. Those routines were left to the constable and the watchman. Boston assembled the first night watch system in America on April 12, 1631. The watch initially served without a constable, but in 1634 the colonial courts created the position to further emulate the English system. The Boston night watch was to see that all disturbances and disorders in the night shall be prevented and suppressed by walking their rounds with a rattle, sounding the alarm by spinning it at the first sign of trouble. This is why they were often referred to as the rattle watch. The most serious danger against which the night watch stood guard was not so much criminal activity, but fires, which posed the deadliest hazard to the all-wooden cities of the day, a lesson Boston learned all too well in 1652 when they suffered a series of horrendously deadly fires. The watch was also tasked with lighting street lamps at night and extinguishing them in the morning. For all of this they were paid a paltry sum, and on top of that, if they did have to appear in court, the night watch were only paid $2 a day, not the $3 that sheriffs earned. The constable and watch systems were never highly respected in England or America, considered by most to be grossly ineffective. As far back as the late 16th century, the asinine Constable Dogberry and his night watchmen were written to be buffoons in Shakespeare's play Much Ado About Nothing. In one scene, when the aristocratic Conrad calls Constable Dogberry an ass, Dogberry accepts the title as one of nobility, imploring his masters to "Remember that I am an ass, though it be not written down, yet forget not that I am an ass." The constable and watch system established in Boston fared little better than its English counterpart. Despite improvements in the payment system and the move to make watch service mandatory for all able-bodied males, many simply ignored the call or paid for a replacement, which meant the force was neither effective nor well respected. And even when those who could afford to avoid service on the watch made their payment, the money was never used to hire a suitable replacement. The constable warned a number of housekeepers to attend him for the night. Benjamin Franklin complained of the Philadelphia watch, but those who chose never to attend paid him 6 shillings a year to be excused, which was supposed to be for hiring substitutes, but was in reality much more than was necessary for that purpose, and made the constableship a place of profit. The constable, for a little drink, Franklin added, often got such ragamuffins about him as a watch that respectable housekeepers did not choose to mix with, and walking the rounds, too, was often neglected, and most of the nights spent in tippling. It was the same situation all over the American colonies. One individual living in New York City in the 1750s complained the night watchmen there were a parcel of idle, drinking, vigilant snorers, who never quelled any nocturnal tumult in their lives, but would perhaps be as ready to joining in burglary as any thief in Christendom. In 1808, a commentator in the Louisiana Gazette complained of the same problems in New Orleans, writing that, since substitutes have been allowed, the patrol is composed principally of the most worthless part of the community. It is like setting wolves to guard the sheep. To improve the fitness and reliability of the watch, Franklin had advocated for a paid police force to be funded by levying a tax on property. Unfortunately for Franklin, it was not until 1838 that the city of Boston enacted such measures. Even well into the 19th century, law enforcement wasn't much more sophisticated than the rattle watch of the early 17th century. In the early 1800s, the constables and roundsmen of New York City were known as the Leatherheads for the tight-fitting leather helmets they wore. They were not well respected by the adults of New York City, and for the youth they often proved an abundant source of amusement. Youthful and exuberant New Yorkers considered an evening out was not spent in the orthodox manner unless they played some rough practical jokes on the poor old inoffensive leatherheads, wrote retired police chief George Washington Walling, reminiscing about the early days of the force. It is recorded of such a staid young man as Washington Irving, of Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle fame, even that he was in the habit of upsetting watch-boxes if he caught a leatherhead asleep inside, and on one occasion, so it is said, he lassoed the box with a stout rope, and with the aid of companions dragged it down Broadway, while the watchmen inside yelled loudly for help. It was in truth so common to find the night watchman asleep during Washington Irving's day that New Yorkers often quipped, "While the city sleeps, the watchmen do too." Such was the sorry state, of early policing in the 18th century. So, when the United States of America formed its first government, it could not look to the local police to enforce its laws. The system of sheriffs, constables, and watchmen was grossly inadequate to the new national government's interests, not to mention it did not fall under the authority or control of the federal government. Indeed, it was that very fact that proved to be a selling point for ratification of the United States Constitution. On Thursday, August 30th, 1787, the members of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia took up the issue of law enforcement when they entertained Article 18, which became Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution. The proposed article read, "The United States shall guarantee to each state a republican form of government, and shall protect each state against foreign invasion, and on the application of its legislature against domestic violence." There was little debate over the proposal, only the motion to drop the word foreign, and a short debate over changing domestic violence to insurrection, although in the end that latter edit was dropped. The vote was 9-2 in favor of retaining the amendment, and the convention moved on. This section of the Constitution was very intentionally constructed to prevent another Shays Rebellion, which was still fresh in everyone's mind. That short-lived rebellion had broken out in August of 1786, before finally being quelled in June of 1787. At the close of the American Revolution, many of the 13 original states had found themselves deep in debt, unable to secure new lines of credit. In desperate need of income, their governments raised taxes on their own people, and this immediately after having just concluded a bloody war, largely fought because of the oppressive taxes the English crown had levied. But even more oppressive to the people was the heavy hand used in collecting those state taxes. Aggrieved, protesters gathered, with one farmer lamenting, "I have been greatly abused, have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, continental rates, been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth." The farmer, whose alias was Plow Jogger, called for rebellion. "The great men are going to get all we have," he told the assembly, "and I think it is time for us to rise and put a stop to it, and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers." The crowd agreed, and eventually a reluctant Daniel Shays was nominated from among them to serve as leader of the uprising. These rebels, often referred to as the Shaysites, immediately sought to shut down the local courts through protests. The judges, not appreciating the disruption to their business, issued court orders for the rebels' arrest. This only succeeded in ratcheting up the tension. Everything came to a head on January 25, 1787, when the rebels decided to raid the Springfield Armory so as to properly arm themselves. The plan was a disaster because half of the rebels failed to show on time, and the militia had caught wind of the planned attack and were well prepared to face them. In that action, 4 of Shays's men were killed, another 20 were wounded, and the rest fled into the night. The hunt to bring the rebels to justice continued through most of the rest of 1787. As the roundup was still underway, the Constitutional Convention was convening in Philadelphia, and Shays's rebellion was frequently discussed implicitly and explicitly in their debates. As to whether or not states would have the right to provide for their own protection, however, there was little debate. The members agreed that each state would be guaranteed a republican form of government. Only when state governments were overwhelmed with some form of domestic violence would the national government be permitted to step in and assist, and even then only upon the state's application to Congress. It was clarified that were Congress not in session, the application was to be presented to the President. By virtue of this, states retained the right to enforce their own laws, rather than having the national government step in to take control whenever it saw fit. This played an important role in the ratification of the Constitution. The evening before John Bly and Charles Rose were to be hanged for their role in Shays's rebellion, as Delaware and Pennsylvania were to take up the vote for ratification of the new U.S. Constitution, Publius published the next installment of the Federalist Papers. It was actually Alexander Hamilton who was claiming to be of the people, and with James Madison and John Jay was penning the Federalist essays in the hopes of convincing the citizens of each state, as well as their state representatives, to ratify the Constitution. In his third of 6 essays on the limited powers of the presidency, known as Federalist No. 17, Hamilton turned his attention to the administration of criminal and civil justice. Attempting to quell fears that ratifying the Constitution would bestow the American president with the power of a despot, Hamilton assured his readers that the chief executive would have little power over the state governments. Hamilton promised one transcendent advantage belonging to the province of the state governments, which alone suffices to place the matter in a clear and satisfactory light, by which he meant the ordinary administration of criminal and civil justice. He continued, "This, of all others, is the most powerful, most universal, and most attractive source of popular obedience and attachment. It is that which, being the immediate and visible guardian of life and property, having its benefits and its terrors in constant activity before the public eye, regulating all those personal interests and familiar concerns to which the sensibility of individuals is more immediately awake, contributes more than any other circumstances to impressing upon the minds of the people affection, esteem, and reverence toward the government. His assurance was that states, not the national government, would have the power of both criminal justice and civil justice, which would give them power commensurate to the national governments, leaving little fear of a president-despot. For even were the president to attempt tyranny, he would have no criminal or civil justice powers by which to control the people. Effectively, he would have no police force. Hamilton drove his point home. "This great cement of society," he wrote, "which will diffuse itself almost wholly through the channels of the particular governments, independent of all other causes of influence, would ensure them so decided an empire over their respective citizens as to render them at all times a complete counterpoise, and, not unfrequently, dangerous rivals to the power of the Union." In other words, were the national government to try to wield its powers over the states and its people would have nothing to fear. They would have leverage over the national government because they had the mechanisms of criminal and civil justice in their hands. On June 21, 1788, delegates from New Hampshire cast the 9th vote in favor, ratifying the U.S. Constitution. Now the country needed to begin implementing the Constitution. One of the first orders of business was to select a chief executive. That first presidential election was held between December 15, 1788, and January 10, 1789. When the electoral votes were tabulated, it was unanimous. George Washington was to become the first president of the United States. Elections for the first members of Congress were also held between December of 1788 and March of 1789. So, come early April, the first Congress of the United States was seated, and on April 30, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City, George Washington was inaugurated. By the time Washington was seated as president, Congress was already hard at work. As historian Gordon S. Wood explains, the Senate immediately established a committee to draft a judiciary bill, chaired by Oliver Ellsworth, an experienced jurist from Connecticut who had been a member of the Constitutional Convention. 2 months later, on July 12, 1789, Virginia's Senator Richard Henry Lee reported the first bill ever out of committee. Senate Bill No. 1 was known as the Judiciary Act of 1789. Despite Hamilton's assurances to the contrary, anti-federalists were fearful that the Judiciary Act was nothing more than a power grab by the national government. Ellsworth and committee, however, were well aware of the fears of a national judiciary that the anti-federalists had aroused during the ratification debates, especially fears of a national judiciary that omitted certain common law rights, like trial by jury, which wouldn't be guaranteed until the Bill of Rights was ratified several years later in 1791. They knew full well that the possibility of conflict between the new federal government and the states was thus very great. After considerable debate, the Senate finally passed the act with a vote of 14-6 on July 17, 1789. It then went to the House of Representatives for consideration, which spanned the rest of July and all of August. For a first bill, it was highly contentious. But the stakes were high, for it was essentially creating the entire third branch of government, defining the powers of the executive branch. A vote was finally called on September 19th, and it passed, 37-16. But further amendments had been called for, which were voted on and passed on September 21st. The final version was agreed upon that same day, and the bill was sent to the executive. On September 24th, President George Washington signed into law the first congressional act of the new government, which was, as historian Wood summed it, an ingenious bundle of compromises that allayed many of the anti-federalist suspicions. The compromise resulted in a three-tiered judiciary, with the Supreme Court at the head, a series of circuit appellate courts in between, and district courts at the bottom. The new law did not assume the authority or responsibility of the previously established state courts, but allowed the federal courts to coexist alongside the state courts, sometimes sharing the same resources, often the very same courtrooms. This was common occurrence, especially in the lower district courts, where it was generally the case that a local resident was selected to serve as the judge, thus deflecting any notion of outside control by the national government. These local courts were then responsible for the fee schedules and modes of selecting jurors, and were to have jurisdiction over admiralty cases, petty crimes, and revenue collection. As the district court judges were to be appointed to serve as arbiters of the law, not administrators, Congress realized another person was needed to handle such things as the fee schedules, the formation of juries, and especially collection of revenue. Even more importantly, someone needed to be empowered to enforce the laws, a role certainly not suited to a member of the judiciary branch. And so, because the Judiciary Act had been based on the organization and structure of the colonial and wartime admiralty courts, which itself had been based on the British vice-admiralty courts, Congress retained the title of the man who held those responsibilities. Thus, out of the Judiciary Act of 1789 was born the United States Marshals Service, the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country. Section 27 of the Judiciary Act put forth that a marshal shall be appointed in and for each district for the term of 4 years, in order to execute throughout the district all lawful precepts directed to him, and issued under the authority of the United States. It further stated the marshal shall have power to command all necessary assistance in the execution of his duty, and to appoint as there shall be occasion 1 or more deputies. This gave the district marshal the ability to not only appoint deputy marshals, but also deputize civilians in a time of need. The section of the Act also included the oath of office the marshal and his deputies would swear by. I, A.B., do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute all lawful precepts directed to the marshal of the district of blank, under the authority of the United States, and true returns make, and in all things well and truly, and without malice or partiality, perform the duties of the office of marshal, or marshal's deputy, as the case may be, of the district of blank, during my continuance in said office, and take only my lawful fees, so help me God. Further sections of the Act describe the duties and responsibilities of the marshals, and they were many. The primary function of the marshals, explains Frederick S. Calhoun, first historian of the U.S. Marshals, was to support the federal district courts. They served the subpoenas, summonses, writs, warrants, and other process issued by the courts, made all the arrests, and handled all prisoners. They also disbursed the money, paying the fees and expenses of the court clerks, U.S. attorneys, jurors, and witnesses. They rented the courtrooms and jail space, and hired the bailiffs, criers, and janitors. The marshals also took care of the details by making sure the water pitchers were filled, the prisoners were present, the jurors were available, and the witnesses were on time. A U.S. Marshal was clearly to be a jack of all trades, shouldering all of the responsibilities necessary to ensure the district courts ran. President Washington wasted little time in appointing U.S. Marshals to the original 13 district courts. His first appointment embodied Washington's ideal candidate. Nathaniel Ramsey was named the first Marshal of the Maryland District Court, partly as an act of political patronage, and partly in reward for the bravery he had exhibited at the Battle of Monmouth. When General Washington had arrived at Monmouth on June 28, 1778, he discovered that the British had surrounded the courthouse, and that General Charles Lee had ordered his troops to flee soon after the British had opened fire. Washington was livid. To prevent further loss and to turn the tide of the battle, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey to take his regiments and hold.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?